you may be walking around now, today, and maybe you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s, and maybe you're wondering why you're having such a hard time finding your soulmate or why it's hard for you to make money. You have to understand that our bodies are really made of energy. So when we think about emotions, emotions are also energy. But that internal computer, that subconscious mind, I believe, is intelligent beyond our ability to comprehend it. And I believe that the reason for that is because we are divine beings. When you release emotional baggage, it changes your personality, and it never ever changes it into a worse personality. 90% of all the physical pain that people have is actually due to their emotional baggage. The emotion code is energy medicine, and energy medicine, like Einstein said, it is the medicine of the future because our bodies are made of energy.
Cześć, nazywam się Ania Wędzikowska, a to jest mój podcast Ku Szczęściu. Jeśli podobają Ci się te treści, skomentuj, polub, zasubskrybuj, podziel się ze znajomymi. Niech szczęście płynie w świat. Jak zwykle mam wyjątkowego gościa. Dzisiaj moim gościem jest Bradley Nelson, twórca kodu emocji, kodu ciała, niezwykła osoba, która zmienia życie ludzi, również w Polsce, bo często bywa w Polsce. Hello, Bradley. You're here in Poland again.
Yes, I'm back in Warsaw and loving it. I love Poland. It's such a beautiful country and beautiful people. And so thanks for having me back on your show.
You keep coming back. How is it working with Polish people? What kind of challenges do they face mainly?
Well, people in Poland face the same challenges that everybody faces, right? And where our work comes in with the emotion code is that we help people get rid of their emotional baggage. And everyone has emotional baggage, but there, I would say, is probably a little more emotional baggage
because of the trauma,
Poland.
Past trauma.
Yeah, because of the war. We receive emotional energy at conception from mom or dad. And so you may be walking around now, today, and maybe you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s, and maybe you're wondering why you're having such a hard time finding your soulmate, or why it's hard for you to make money, or why you can't seem to shake these physical or mental problems. And all of that can be caused by these emotional energies.
So what is emotional code, and what is your method about? How do you sort of target those backed up emotions, those blockages, and how do you help people release them?
Well, the first thing that you have to understand is that our bodies, even though they seem solid and they have mass and they take up a certain amount of weight and so on, you have to understand that our bodies are really made of energy. That's why Albert Einstein, probably 100 years ago or so, said that the medicine of the future will be the medicine of frequencies. And Nikola Tesla, even before that, said, if you want to understand the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And so now here we are, we're in the 21st century, and we're finally beginning to realize that these very, very smart guys were right, and that our bodies are really made of pure energy. In fact, as difficult as this is to imagine, these quantum physicists say that if you could remove all the empty space from in between all of the atoms in your body, and if you could do the same thing for everyone else in the world, you could fit all 7.8 billion people in the world into a box the size of a sugar cube. Yeah. And it's so hard for us to wrap our heads around that, because it's just not how we are used to looking at things and thinking of things. But so when we think about emotions are also energy. See, everything in the world that we live in, everything in the universe ultimately is made of energy. This table, the chair, the walls, the earth, the sun, the moon, the stars, everything ultimately is made of nothing but energy. In fact, Albert Einstein himself said that there really is no matter as such. He said, matter is just energy that has had its frequency slowed down in vibration enough to a point that we can actually see it or touch it and feel it and so on. Well, so emotions are also frequency. So when you're feeling an intense emotion like anger or resentment or grief or sadness, on a quantum level, what's happening is your body is vibrating at a different rate. And if you're feeling that emotion powerfully, your whole being can now be vibrating at this new frequency. And if you decide that you don't want to feel that emotion and you bury that emotion, or if you decide that you're going to enhance that emotion artificially and you become really upset and you choose that, or if something happens that's just overwhelming. You said you lost your mother and in the last year. That's a very difficult thing. Losing a family member, having something really tragic like that happen, those emotions can be overwhelming. And so in any of those three circumstances, either burying the emotion or artificially enhancing it or just having something happen that's overwhelming, any of those three circumstances can result in what we call a trapped emotion. When we have an emotional experience, it's always in response to some kind of a stimuli, right? Someone has said something, or you see something or think something, and then a particular emotion starts to surface for you. You start to feel that emotion. And you may think certain thoughts that go along with that emotion. You may even feel certain physical sensations that go along with a certain emotion. And most of the time, the vast majority of the time, we simply acknowledge that emotion and we allow it to dissipate its energy, and the loop closes on that experience. And now that experience is over with and we're ready for the next emotional experience. But in the three circumstances that I described, that loop then becomes stuck open. And so that emotional energy then stays in the body and it has not really been expressed. And that experience is not really completed. And so we have these incomplete emotional experiences. That's what creates trapped emotions. And a trapped emotion is a little ball of energy from about the size of a baseball to about the size of maybe a small melon. And these lodge in the body and then they create problems. Now, as a holistic doctor, I was just trying to figure out what was wrong with my patients, right? But I had also been a computer programmer starting back in the early 1980s. I had a business called The Computer Tutor. And I would go into people's businesses and I would write the software for these computers that people were buying back in those days, long before your time, when there was no software, right? And so I had a lot of fun and it was really interesting. But when I became a doctor, it began to dawn on me that these patients that I was working on also were like a computer, that there was a computer within them, in essence, what you could call the subconscious mind, that was a computer that was contained within them, but that had access to all the information about what was going on with them. In other words, every single person is walking around with this internal computer that we really take for granted. It's this incredibly powerful computer that is creating millions of new cells every minute. It's keeping your heart beating all your life. It's keeping air moving in and out of your lungs all of your life. It's doing all these amazing things, trillions of chemical reactions every minute. And we just take it for granted. We don't even think about it, right? But that internal computer, that subconscious mind, I believe, is intelligent beyond our ability to comprehend it. And I believe that the reason for that is because we are divine beings. And this body, these bodies that we have, these bodies literally, I believe, are temples that house our eternal spirit that I believe has been alive forever and will continue to live forever. And right now we're having this physical experience in these physical bodies, and it's a really important part, I believe, of our progression. But sometimes we develop emotional baggage or these trapped emotions. And what do these things do to us? Well, they affect us in a couple of ways. One of my favorite stories an experience that I had many years ago. A man came in to see me, and he had really severe low back pain. On a 0 to 10 scale of pain, he was about a 9. 10 is the most pain you can have. So he was contemplating having surgery. It had been going on for a while, and it was just miserable. So I, at that time, had learned enough about these emotional energies and learned how to communicate with this internal computer. And so I started asking some questions of his internal computer, and we do that through different ways, but mainly muscle testing. And so I was asking questions, getting yes and no answers from his computer, his subconscious mind. And the answer that came back was that he had emotional energy that was causing this pain. And in the emotion code, we have a chart of emotions that we use that contains 60 emotions. It's divided into 2 columns and 6 rows. And so really quickly, I was able to figure out that this emotion was anger. That was the emotion. And then I was able to trace this back, again, just asking more questions. And this probably only took about a minute or 2 really to figure this out. And this had occurred 20 years before. And when I arrived at that, he said, I know exactly what that's about. And I said, really? And he told me that 20 years before, he was working for this company, and he was wrongly accused of embezzling, basically, stealing money from the company. And he had not done that, and he was completely innocent. And there's no feeling quite like being falsely accused of something that you didn't do. And so he was really angry about it. And that was the experience that created this emotional energy. It was just so powerful. So I released that emotion by just swiping down the middle of his back a few times with a magnet. You can also just use your hand. And that releases that energy. And his pain level went from a 9 to a 0 that quickly, just really instantly. And he kept walking around and bending over and twisting this way and that way. And it's like, where did it go? It was gone. And so if you think about it, this illustrates one of the effects. When you have a trapped emotion, what it does, remember, it's like a ball of energy. And so this guy, as strange as it sounds, had this ball of anger in his low back. And what it was doing is it was distorting his normal energy field. You see, trapped emotions will distort. They create this kind of a distorting effect. And so it was interfering with the normal function of that part of his body, interfering with chemical reactions, with blood flow and lymph flow and the flow of meridian energy in the acupuncture system and so on. So when I released it, suddenly the pain was gone. But here's the interesting thing. A few days later, he came back in to see me just for a follow-up. And he said, Dr. Nelson, he said, my back pain is still gone. He said, I still can't believe it. That's just the most amazing thing. But he said, I have to talk to you, because he said, when I came in here, I had another problem that I didn't tell you about. He said, for as long as I can remember, I've basically been what you'd call a rageaholic. He said, I'm always yelling at my wife and my kids. I've got to watch the road rage. He said, I've been to anger management several times. It hasn't really helped me. But he said, since you released that emotion of anger from me, he said, I just feel really different. I just feel kind of peaceful. He said, things that used to set me off and make me just immediately become angry don't affect me anymore. And he said, how did you do that? How does this work? And at the time I said, well, I really don't know. That's really interesting. But what we now believe is that if we take this guy's case, he's got this ball of anger in his low back, right? So remember, anger is a frequency. It's a specific vibration. So when a situation would come along in his life where he might tend to feel the emotion of anger, he would feel it much more easily, much more readily than he otherwise would have. Why? Because part of his body is vibrating at that frequency 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so when we release that, all of a sudden, it changed his personality. And that's one of the really fun things about this, is that when you release emotional baggage, it changes your personality, and it never ever changes it into a worse personality. It always changes you into a better personality. Isn't that interesting?
It is. Maybe it means that the personality that we start with isn't really us, because we have so many trapped emotions that we are unable to operate from our highest frequency and our highest sort of self or whatever.
I think so, yeah. I think what happens is people, when we come into this world, for the most part, we're free of emotional baggage. I think we all have some inherited emotional energy that we bring in, but we end up being thrown off track. We end up changing our personalities because we have all this baggage that we're dragging through life. And so my mission in this world has been to bring this and some of these other healing methodologies into the world to help people understand how there is so much that they can do for themselves. There's always going to be a need for Western medicine, right? And it's good that we have Western medicine because sometimes we have traumatic injuries and things. But most of the time, most people don't need some dramatic intervention. Most of the time, most people don't need drugs. And most of the time, most people don't need some kind of invasive surgery. But on the other hand, a lot of the time, people have symptoms. People may have depression. They may have anxiety or panic attacks or phobias or post-traumatic stress disorder, or they may be dealing with self-sabotage or weight that they can't get rid of, right? These are all common problems. People deal with all kinds of physical pain. I mean, think of all the pain clinics there are in the world. 90% of all the physical pain that people have is actually due to their emotional baggage. And all they have to do is use the emotion code and find out that that's absolutely true. We've certified now over 15,000 practitioners in 108 countries so far around the world. And we're all finding the same thing, that when people are experiencing physical pain of some kind, 9 times out of 10, there is emotional energy that's causing that. And when you release that emotional energy, that's gone. In fact, I just did a workshop last night downtown here in Warsaw. And we had quite a few people in this hall. And there was a woman that came up that has had pain for 6 years, pain in her uterus. And she has also been trying to conceive and has had no luck conceiving, and was diagnosed with some, tumors and so on, fibroids and so on in her uterus. But I mean, her pain level was a 9 on a 0 to 10 scale. In her case, we found, I think, 4 different trapped emotions that were all inherited. So at conception, she received these emotional energies from her mom or from her dad. I think maybe 3 were from her dad and 1 was from her mom. I can't remember exactly, but every time we would release one, her pain level would go down until finally, after we cleared the last one, she had no pain at all anymore for the first time in 6 years. And I think she's also probably going to be able to have a child. Western medicine can't do this kind of thing because Western medicine is based on pharmaceuticals and it's all chemistry and so on. But energy medicine is what this is. The emotion code is energy medicine. And energy medicine, like Einstein said, it is the medicine of the future because our bodies are made of energy. And so it only makes sense that we should deal with our bodies for what they really are, right? Which is energy.
You mentioned the muscle test. This is something that Hawkins was talking about, and it basically assumes that we have the knowledge, internal knowledge about everything that happens with our bodies that we just know, even though we don't know consciously. Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, yes, that's absolutely true. One of the things that Dr. Hawkins used to do with his audiences is he would create little paper packets that had, let's see, I think it was sugar or powdered milk in them. And he would hand them out. And then people would test each other. They would hold one of these packets to their body, and then they would have someone else test them. And if it was sugar, they would be weak. And if it was just powdered milk, they would be strong. I think that's how the test went.
It's because sugar is bad for your body.
Sugar's bad
that
for
was
us,
the
right?
Sort of
Yeah, it's a white poison that's so delicious. It's a problem. By the way, I have to tell you, I think Poland may have the best desserts of any country I've ever visited.
It might be. I'm trying to quit sugar, but I do understand what you're saying. Yes.
It's really amazing. Great food. I think people have no idea how good the food is here. But anyway, so, if you think about it, these bodies of ours are so miraculous, right? They say that the average cell in the human body is equivalent in complexity to a full-sized aircraft carrier with thousands of people working at their own individual jobs, with jets on the ramp with their engines ready to go, ready to take off, people working on electronic countermeasures and radar and all kinds of things. That's how complex a single cell is. And the latest estimate is that if you're an adult, you have probably about 37 trillion of those. And I absolutely believe, without any reservation at all, that if you needed to communicate with a single individual cell, if you needed to ask your subconscious mind about the status of one single cell, it could tell you. It knows exactly what's going on with you all the time. And when I was in practice, remember that I had been a computer programmer. And so for about 18 years, I was practicing, and it was a perfect environment for me where I was experimenting with patients and beginning to learn more and more and more about how I could get information from these patients' subconscious minds and figure out what was really going on with them. And it got to a point where in my practice, most of the people that were coming to me were people that had been told there was really no hope for them at all in Western medicine. Nothing could be done. And that they were going to have to just deal with or live with their problem for the rest of their life. And these were very sick people. These were most of my patients during the last 10 years of my practice, because I had figured out how to work with them. And what I would do with them is I would simply communicate with their subconscious mind and ask questions about what was really going on. And see, in Western medicine, symptoms that we have, physical pain, infertility, asthma, digestive problems, you name it, all of these symptoms are looked at as the problem. But it began to dawn on me that Western medicine was looking at things through the wrong filter, that these symptoms that we experience are really nothing more than the subconscious computer trying to communicate to us that something needed attention. And so if you think about your phone, for example, your phone has icons. If it's a smartphone, which it probably is, it's got a touch screen. So your phone is really a computer, right? And you can communicate with it. You can see messages on the screen, and you can use your finger to touch the icons and communicate with things. If you're working on a laptop computer or a desktop computer, you'll have a screen where you can see messages from the computer, and then you can communicate with the keyboard, right? You use the keyboard to communicate with the computer. So that would be a screen/keyboard interface. But as a computer programmer, I began to realize that the computer that is within each one of us is a computer unlike any computer that we are used to working with in our world. Completely different, because it's a binary computer. So in other words, we can ask questions and we can get answers as long as the answer can be returned by the body in the form of a yes or a no. And the easiest way to determine that is through strength or weakness. So for example, if I were to test you, if you were to hold out your arm and if you were to say your name or that, your name is your name, you would be strong. If you were to say something incongruent, like if you were to say, my name is Jill, instead of Anna, you'd be weak, right? And so we can ask questions and we can get answers. And so in my practice, this became just incredibly invaluable because I wasn't afraid to deal with any kind of problem. I knew that no matter what a person had been diagnosed with, I knew that I could figure out what the answers really were, what the subconscious really, why a person was having this problem. And so it's so interesting because it was the perfect laboratory, really, for me, right? For all those years, seeing all these patients, and I loved my patients and had a wonderful time helping them. But almost all of those patients over all those years were able to get well. Mm-hmm. And that's because rather than giving them medication to suppress their symptoms, I was coming at it from a completely different angle, asking their own internal computer, why are you having these symptoms? What are the underlying causes? And what I found was that emotional baggage that we've been talking about is by far the number one biggest common denominator for all of these problems that we experience.
Bradley, you probably realize that we as people are so used to the fact that some things are impossible, some things are very, very difficult. They take time, and curing symptoms that we've had for years and years seems like something that has to be done through medication or hard work, or maybe it's impossible and I'm going to have to indulge it for the rest of my life. So it is tempting, but also hard to believe, I imagine, that it can be done just like this. So what is happening exactly when you, as you mentioned, you pat someone's back or just, do something with a magnet or with a hand? Or sometimes I know, because I've been to many sessions with Marta, one of your students and one of the people that brought you as the treasure to Poland. Sometimes you also do that to yourself. So what exactly is happening when we communicate to our bodies, to ourselves, that we are releasing the energy?
Right. Well, again, you have to remember, and you have to keep in mind, that the body, even though the body is solid, there's something else going on. And that is that the body really is just made of energy. If you shine a bright enough light at the body, your bones will make, will show up as shadows on the wall. And we call that X-ray, but it's just a bright enough light that we can't even comprehend it. We can't see it with our naked eyes, but yet that's what it is. People often report feeling lighter. One of my favorite stories is one of our practitioners told us that she went to work on a woman at her home. And after working on her, she released some trapped emotions from her son, who I think was 10 years old. And when she was done working on him, he jumped up and just ran out of the room. And they looked at each other and kind of wondered what was going on. And about a minute later, he came back into the room looking thoroughly confused. And his mother said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Well, yeah." And she said, "Well, you look like you're really confused or something. What's going on?" He said, "This morning I weighed myself, and I know exactly how much I weighed this morning. And I know that I have to be at least 10 pounds lighter now, but I weigh the exact same amount on the scale. And I don't understand it." Right? Think about that. So the thing is, energy can change instantly. Now, a lot of it has to do, really, it ultimately has to do with the subatomic particles that make up the atoms and that make up everything. So if you go down past the level of the atom, you find these subatomic particles that are the smallest known parts of matter and of everything. And we know that their behavior will change depending on what the observer is expecting to see. They've proven this many, many times, countless times in physics. How is that working? Why do these particles change their behavior depending on what the observer is expecting to see? Well, no one really knows. Some believe that these particles themselves are somehow imbued with intelligence, which is what I believe. Some believe that these particles and everything is under the control of this universal mind, the mind of God that is the matrix of all matter, to quote Niels Bohr, a great physicist. But anyway, these things can change, and so they can change instantaneously. So this is not at all unusual. But yes, you're absolutely right that, we're used to thinking that things take a long time to change. When I was 7 years old, I actually was introduced to this possibility that things can change instantly. And what happened was I was really sick with the measles. And my parents had made a bed for me on the couch in the living room in the upstairs of our 2-story house so I could be near their bedroom. And I had overheard them talking, and I knew that the next day I was going to be admitted to the hospital, and I was going into something called an oxygen tent. And I didn't really know what that was. The tent part sounded fun to my 7-year-old brain, but I was way too sick to think about camping. So my parents, everyone else had gone to bed this particular night, and my parents came into the room, and my mother said to my father, she said, "Honey, will you kneel down with me and say a prayer for our boy so he'll be able to get well?" And so they did. They knelt down by the side of the couch, and my dad starts to pray for me and asking God to heal me. And knowing my dad, this was probably the first time in my life that I'd heard my dad pray out loud. He wasn't a preacher or anything like that. He was in real estate and construction. But as he's praying for me, and I'm lying there feeling really sick, just nauseated and feverish and just feeling awful, in the middle of this prayer, something happens. This change begins at the top of my head, and it goes through my body to the soles of my feet. And I was instantaneously completely healed. And I held my tongue. I was bursting with excitement, right? And I held my tongue till my dad was done praying. I didn't want to interrupt him. I was a polite kid. But as soon as he was done, I said, "I'm better. I'm better. I'm better." And they said, "That's fine, honey. Go back to sleep." And they didn't really realize that I was absolutely, completely healed. So the next day proved to everybody that I was completely well. So I was only 7 years old, but that taught me 2 things. It taught me that, number 1, there's a higher power that we can draw upon. And number 2, healing doesn't have to take place over a long time. It can happen instantaneously because it happened to me. And the interesting thing about it is these subatomic energies are affected by our own beliefs, right? If you believe that you're going to be sick, you'll probably be sick. If you believe you're going to die, you're probably going to die. In fact, a famous story about that was a woman that went into the hospital. She wasn't feeling well. They ran all these tests, and the doctor told her that there was nothing they could do, that what she had was incurable, and she probably had about 6 months to live, that she should get her affairs in order. 6 months later, almost to the day, she died. And a few months after that, they were doing a records review at the hospital and found that this woman's name was very similar to a different woman's name, and their records had been mixed up. And her test actually had been negative. The other woman was the one that had the incurable problem. I don't think there really is such a thing as an incurable problem. People are told that all the time in Western medicine. And I think incurable just means that it can't be cured with drugs or surgery. But drugs and surgery are great for acute problems. But like I said before, the vast majority of the time, that isn't what people really need.
So is the release of this stored energy, is it connected to the fact that the person becomes aware of it and then communicates to the body that it is released, in terms, there's this kind of a message that we give to our body? How does this work exactly?
Well, the way I look at it, remember we talked about the emotional loop, right?
Yes.
When you have an emotional experience and an emotion is coming up and you bury it, that leaves you with an open loop,
yeah.
right? An unfinished emotional experience. Or if you enhance the emotion artificially, you get really upset, fly off the handle. You're probably embarrassed later that you got so upset. That will create an emotional loop or an open loop. Or if the emotional experience is just overwhelming. And so really the emotion code is just a way to identify the emotional loops and close those loops, right? And so sometimes we need to find more information. I remember once I was doing a workshop. It was actually in Las Vegas. And as people were coming into this room, this hall, I was standing at the door and greeting people as they were coming in. And this young woman showed up with her mother. So I met the two of them. Later on, as I was teaching, I asked for a volunteer, and this young woman came up, and she and her mother were sitting right on the front row. And so she came up. She was about 21 years old, and I was going to demonstrate the emotion code. So I'll kind of walk everybody through this so you can kind of get a mental picture how this works. And so I asked her first if she had any kind of issues going on, mental, physical, emotional, and she said no. She seemed perfectly healthy. So I asked her to hold her arm out, and then I can't remember her first name, but I had her say her name was her name. If her name was Nikki, then she said, "My name is Nikki." And I pressed down on her outstretched arm, and she was strong. And you can try this at home, by the way. And then I had her say something that wasn't true, like her name was Joanne or something, and her arm was weak. And so then I asked, and of course, that's a response from the subconscious mind, right? So then I asked, do you have a trapped emotion that we can release? And the answer came back strong, yes. And so I said, okay. So we have a chart of emotions. 60 emotions is divided up into 2 columns and 6 rows. And you can find this emotion code chart by just Googling. It's everywhere. Anyway, so I asked if this emotion was in column A on the chart. And I probably got a no. And so it was in column B in an odd row or an even row. And I got a yes on one of those. And then we narrowed it down to the column, or to this exact cell, the column and row. And then as I continued to ask questions about the individual emotions, the answer that came up was the emotion was forlorn. Now, forlorn in English is it's kind of feeling all alone and hopeless and desolate and lonely, all kind of rolled into one. And so when we find the emotion in the emotion code, when we identify the emotion, the next question we ask is, do we need to know more? In other words, what we're doing is we found an open loop. We know what the emotion is, but is there more information we need to determine to be able to close that loop and finish that experience? Sometimes you do. And in her case, her subconscious mind said, yes, we need to know more information. Well, the first thing that we do is we ask when it happened, right? So say she was 21, I think. So I asked, okay, did this happen earlier than age 10? The answer was yes. Oh, okay. And the answer by yes, I mean her outstretched arm is strong for yes, weak for no. And then I asked, did it happen earlier than age 5? Yes. Oh, okay. Did it happen before you were born? No, because sometimes that happens. Emotions can occur in the womb and so on. In the first year of your life? Yes. It happened in the first year of her life. So I thought, okay, well, she's not going to remember anything about this. And I asked her, I said, do you have any idea what this might be about? And she said, no, I have no idea. Well, remember that this girl had come to this event with her mother. So I looked out of the audience, and there's her mother, and she's as white as a ghost. And she's got her hands covering her mouth and nose, and her eyes are like saucers. And I said, hey, do you have any idea what this might be about? And she was so embarrassed, but she said she thought she did know. She said that back in those days when she was raising her daughter, she used to use cloth diapers. And one day she accidentally pinned her daughter to her diaper. So in other words, she was closing the diaper and the pin went through her daughter's flesh. And she didn't know about it until she changed her the next time. So for several hours, probably, this poor baby is crying and not getting any help. And her mom must have been so overwhelmed. And her mom was horrified to find that she'd actually done this to her daughter. Well, so I asked this girl's subconscious mind, is that what created this trapped emotion? And the answer that came back was strong. And there wasn't anything else we needed to know. So I swiped a few times down her back to release it. Now, this probably took about a minute, maybe a minute and a half. And that was it. And so that released the trapped emotion. We release when we go down the back like this. What we're doing is we're putting energy and intention, and intention is a form of energy. We're putting that into the governing meridian, which goes right down the back. And that intention and that energy goes into all the meridians of the body, and it has the effect of just closing the loop. And that experience now is finally able to be done with, right? So she had had that open loop, that emotional loop stuck open all those years, right? 20 years or so. So this is not the end of the story.
It is not.
No, because what happened was about 10 days later, I got an email, and it was from this girl's mother. And she said, listen, she said, my daughter didn't tell you this, but she said, for about the last 10 years or so, she's had a problem with her hip and her knee. I think it was on the right side. She's had pain in her hip and in her knee. And we've taken her to lots of different people to try to fix this problem, and nobody's been able to fix it. And she just lives with it. And so when I asked her if she had any issues, well, because she just kind of ignored this, she said no, she didn't have any issues. People do that, you know. I remember one time I had a patient that I was asking if she had any issues, and she said, well, I just have normal headaches. And I said, what? Normal headaches? Do you realize no headache is normal? Really? And she just had no idea. But anyway, this girl's mother said that it was also beginning to affect, the pain was beginning to affect the way that she walked. And she said they just didn't know what to do. But she said the moment that we released that trapped emotion of forlorn from her, from being pinned to her diaper, the pain was gone in her hip and in her knee. And also, the way that she was walking was completely normalized. And she said, I waited 10 days because I just thought maybe this was a fluke. But she said, after 10 days, this has not come back. I don't think it's coming back. She said, it's just amazing. And also she said, my daughter's feeling this new sense, this new lightness of being that she's never felt before. And she's telling everyone about this. So there's a great example that illustrates a couple of things, right? First of all, there's an instantaneous change that took place, right? And so change with energy, it's kind of like turning on a light. When you turn on the light, that energy flows instantly. It doesn't have to, delay like water flowing through your pipes to get hot water sometimes, right? So that happened. The other thing that's interesting about this is that her subconscious mind, that incredibly, incomprehensibly powerful computer within her, knew exactly why she had the pain in her hip and in her knee. And it was from being pinned to the diaper. She didn't even remember. She had no conscious knowledge that had even happened. In fact, that was the very first time she'd heard that, was at that meeting. Her mom had never told her that, hey, I accidentally pinned you to your diaper when you were 1.
As you wouldn't.
No, you wouldn't. No, you just, no, you wouldn't. You wouldn't want to. But it came out there. And so that also illustrates how it's possible to communicate with the subconscious and find things that are unknown to the conscious mind. There are so many different methods that rely on a person's conscious memory. Well, how did you feel about this, or blah, blah, blah. But the thing about it is,
it gets distorted.
Well, it gets distorted. And also, how much memory do we have? She never would have ever found that. Her mom would probably have never told her. And so she would still be in pain. And that was probably, I don't even know, maybe 20 years ago or something. And
it seems like releasing all that stored energy makes people lighter, happier, makes them better people, because they don't have that tension inside. They don't have the anger. They are able to they're lifted up, and they want to bring all the best that's in them to the world. So my question is, how do you see your work? Because it seems like a calling, like something that is a mission to sort of make the world a better place. I know it sounds...
No,
you
it
know,
absolutely is.
it's a lot of pathos in what I'm saying. It's but it is true.
It's absolutely true. And I realize that it's really not about me, but I have always just wanted nothing more than to be an instrument, right, in the hands of God. And when I was about 13 years old, I developed kidney disease, and it was excruciatingly painful, and there was no medical treatment available for me at all. And so it was about a 50-50 chance whether I would survive or not. So my parents took me to see some old-time holistic doctors, and they started working on me. They were not using drugs. They were not using surgery, but they worked on me in a very natural way, and my body started to respond immediately. And within about 3 weeks, I was completely cured, and tests that were redone at the hospital proved it, that I was completely well. So I decided that's what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to be a doctor like these guys. And they practiced out on the edge of town in Great Falls, Montana, in the middle of a wheat field, in a trailer house. Okay. So it was very different from regular Western medicine. But I decided that's what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to be a doctor like these guys. And then I discovered computers, and I became a computer programmer. And so I became totally detoured from this old dream. So in the winter of 1984, a long time ago now, my wife and I went home. I was going to school. I was about 6 months away from going into the Master's in Business Administration program at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. And my wife and I drove up to Montana, where I'm from, and we were sitting around. It was Christmas time. We were sitting around with my mother and father, sitting around the fireplace. And my father said to me, "Are you sure?" This is totally out of the blue. He said, "Are you sure that you don't want to go to chiropractic school and go into the healing arts? It seems like a great career, and you've always wanted to do that." And I said, "No, I'm going this other direction. I'm going to get my business master's, and I'm going to stay in computers and so on." And he said, "Well, why don't you think about it one more time?" So I thought, well, okay. So I thought I had my life figured out, but then my dad asks me this question, and I took him very seriously. He was very smart. And so my wife and I made up a pro and con list of these two different potential futures. And one was, going into the healing arts, and one was staying in business, and they were both long. And now all of a sudden I feel like, well, I'm back in the middle of the fence now. I don't know what to do, because this old dream of mine to be a healer was suddenly resurrected. Mm-hmm. But having learned that there's a higher power that we can draw upon and we can ask for help, that night I got on my knees with my wife and prayed about this and asked for help. So that night, went to sleep. A few hours later, I woke up, and my mind was full of all of these warm, happy thoughts about how great it is to be able to help people naturally and serve people and, and heal people. And I countered it with something like, well, the new IBM PC has a 4 megahertz processor. I mean, just think. And so this happened 3 times that night. I'd wake up, and my mind would be full of all these great thoughts about going into the healing arts, and I would counter it with something else about computers, It's always a tough nut to crack. So that happened 3 times the first night. So the next day, I still don't know what to do. So the next night, I'm on my knees again, praying with my wife. And the second night, I had the same experience. However, on the second night, each time that I was awakened, the thoughts were exponentially more powerful than the time before. And it's hard to describe this, but the third time that I was awakened on the second night, the thoughts of service to mankind and humanity and the whole world were just overwhelming. And right at that moment, I heard a voice that spoke to me, and it said, "This is a sacred calling." So when you say that it's a calling, it absolutely was a calling. But I really didn't know what that meant. I just thought, okay, I accept. and and went to chiropractic school and had a wonderful time there and had a great practice and everything else. But, I was always just trying to figure out what was wrong with my patients. I wanted to fix them, right? I was really driven with this desire to figure out what was really wrong with them, why they were having these symptoms, right? And fix them. I didn't want to Band-Aid people. I wanted to fix them as fast as I possibly could. And so that led really to all of this, all of these discoveries. And so I really do believe that this is why I'm here, right? To bring these methodologies into the world. And so that's the emotion code, the body code. And we have a new book coming out.
Yes, because let's just say that
with
the emotional code and the body code, people can try to do it themselves. That's the tool, and
they can absolutely do it themselves.
And that's the new book that's going to be out in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
Heart,
the heart code.
Yay!
Yes, and this is all about the heart, and that really is the most important. I think the most important single part of the whole message, because the ancient societies believed that the heart was the seat of the soul and the source of love and creativity and romance and the core of our being. And, And in the West, we've never really given any credence to those old ideas, right? We know that the heart is just a pump. It just pumps blood. That's all it really does. And in fact, it wasn't until the 1970s that doctors found that the heart is actually full of gray matter and white matter, which is the material that the brain is made of. And when doctors looked at the communication between the heart and the brain, they found that the vast majority of the communications were not going from the brain to the heart. They were going from the heart to the brain, indicating that the brains that are in our heads are obeying the messages being sent by the brains in our hearts. Well, the ancient peoples believed all these things about the heart. And I think that the reason why is because, if you have ever felt like your heart was going to break, right? Have you ever felt that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, me too. And probably most of your viewers and listeners have felt that too, where it can feel like there's an elephant sitting on your chest or like you can't breathe. If you're feeling really hurt or really deeply grieved, you don't get a knee pain from it or a foot pain or something. You feel it here. And so the heart is under assault in those circumstances. But by the same token, if let's say you're listening to someone singing and their heart is really resonating, they're singing from their heart, from the depth of their soul, you'll feel it here, won't you?
Oh, yeah.
Right? And you get tears in your eyes and you'll look around and you'll see all these other people in the audience that have their hands over their hearts and tears in their eyes too. See? Well, the ancients understood this. And so they decided, you know what? The heart, wow, that's the seat of the soul and all these other things. Well, we're now beginning to realize that those ancient peoples were right, because now we have instrumentation that shows that the heart is up to 1,000 times more powerful as far as generating a magnetic field than the brain. And the magnetic field that the heart generates goes out, 6 feet from your body, 12 feet in diameter, 6 feet in all directions, 2 meters, and probably even more. But what we now know, actually, I remember in the 1960s, I was a kid. And I remember when they first came up with heart transplants, the very first transplant that was done. I remember reading Life magazine about Dr. Richard DeBakey. It was a big deal, right? But the interesting thing is it didn't take too long. When heart transplants began to become routine, doctors started noticing strange things, that patients would sometimes come back and they would report that their taste in music had completely changed, or sports or food, or that they would have memories of being in places that they never in their life had ever visited. And in every case, when they were connected with the family of the donor, they would find out things like, well, yes, our daughter visited Warsaw every year. It was her favorite city in the world. And now you have memories of being there and you've never, ever been there. Well, how weird. Those must be her memories. Or things like, well, yeah, our son was a very avid soccer player, and now you watch soccer all the time on TV and you never used to.
Yeah.
So all of these things, there are books written about this. It's called cellular memory, and you're familiar with all this kind of stuff. But the heart is everything the ancients believed it to be. And what we now know is that when you feel like your heart's going to break, the subconscious mind will put up a wall around that heart. It will generate a wall made from your emotional baggage. And so it can be many layers of emotional energies making up that wall. And when you have a wall around your heart, it becomes much more difficult for you to fall in love, to stay in love, to create the perfect life that for which there is a blueprint in your heart, right? For that perfect life. And so that's what this book, The Heart Code, is about. We explain the heart wall in the emotion code, and we teach people how they can do this themselves. They can take down their own wall. And also in the body code book, Kod Chala and Kod Emoji, those two books here in Poland. And this book comes out in the spring here in Poland, in Polish. But we wanted to really shine another bright light on this whole phenomenon because it's so incredibly powerful. And 9 out of 10 people or more have put up this wall. And so everyone's walking around with this wall and they don't even know it. And it makes life so much more difficult.
And connection makes connection really difficult. You have to promise me then when the book comes out, you're going to come back on the show. Maybe we can do a online interview next time. And you know what? Thank you so much for having your heart open and doing all the work. And it's always, it's always magnificent to meet up with you and to connect with you. And thank you so much. I'm very grateful that I've met you.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, and we'll have to do it again. We'll be back next year.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To był Bradley Nelson. Dziękuję wam bardzo za obejrzenie tego odcinka. Zapraszam na kolejny.